This section of Scripture is about Lazarus. And so we know Lazarus, the basic recap of his story is he died from sickness, and then Jesus performed one of the most amazing miracles of raising him from the dead. And so we'll study that as well as a couple of the immediate events that followed that miracle and how people responded to it. Instead of doing a blanket just reading of the entire thing and then going back and studying it, for time's sake, we're going to read as we go. And so if you have your Bibles, we're going to start right in verse 1, do a little chunk, look at it, and then keep going in that fashion. So, John 11, starting in verse 1, says, "Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, 'Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick.'" So we know that John, unlike a lot of the other writers, he tended to think things out of order from time to time. So not everything that we read is always in a chronological order. So right off the bat, John here mentions Mary having anointed Jesus with oil. However, this hadn't happened just yet in the timeline. We will get there in this study. But this was simply John's way of describing his point of view and letting us know exactly who was there. And so we find that Lazarus was sick. And though we're not told the nature of his sickness here, I suppose we can judge just how severe it must have been by the timing of his death soon after Jesus actually found out about his sickness. So when the sisters, they came to Jesus, they didn't make any kind of request of him, but they simply told him the news, making him aware of the severity of the situation. But their motives are still quite clear. They're asking Jesus to help in this statement. But at the same time, they're leaving that appeal open fully to Jesus. The decision is left to him of what to do. Their need and his love for Lazarus are the entire message itself, and it's left at that. And the love here that's mentioned is that of a pathos love. It's a warm, a personal friendship, affection. So Jesus must have had a very strong friendship and personal bond with Lazarus. At this point in time, we know that Jesus is just beyond the Jordan when he gets this information. And for a distance, a timeline ahead, it's roughly about 30 miles from where Jesus is to Bethany. So he's about 30 miles away from Lazarus. Verse 4, when Jesus heard that, he said, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." So when it says back in verse 3 that the sisters sent to him, this probably meant that they sent a messenger to Jesus to tell him the news. Especially being 30 miles away and having a sick brother, they probably wouldn't have been able to just up and leave to find Jesus. It's not said who Jesus uttered these words to when he received the message, but the implication can be that they were intended by him to be carried back to Mary and Martha. This statement, though to us is crystal clear as it leads to the upcoming events, it would have definitely been confusing to the sisters, since it's most likely that by the time the messenger returned to them with this message, Lazarus probably would have already been dead. It's important to note, however, that Jesus didn't say in his message, "Lazarus will not die." That's not what he said, though this conclusion might have been drawn from his words here. What Jesus is saying is that the result and ultimate design isn't death. Hidden within Jesus' words is the promise of raising Lazarus, though it wasn't apparent at this point to anyone else. So this event of Lazarus being raised from the dead was an occasion to glorify both the Father and the Son, as it says. God would utilize this incident to his glory and to that of his Son by subsequent events which aren't disclosed in this statement, but which would have been seen when they occurred later on. So the sickness of Lazarus, an occasion of utter grief by his sisters and loved ones, would have its end, not, however, the death of their brother to a state that he couldn't be brought back, but the further support of the cause which would bring everlasting life to uncounted millions through Jesus. Verse 5, says, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was." Verse 5 here is a note from John to us, helping us understand why Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus of Lazarus' ill state. And in the same way, it also helps us understand why in verse 6 we see Jesus delayed his trip to Bethany by 2 more days. He didn't stay in where he was due to disinterest, but actually the complete opposite. Delay by deity in granting a favor is not a denial of that favor. Often it's actually to provide the occasion for an even greater favor. Sometimes in our lives, when our petitions to the Lord aren't granted, it's because he is withholding the less in order to provide the greater blessing. I think that's an important thing for us to realize in our lives. The love here in verse 5 mentioned is more of an agape love, which is more of the abstract, the godly type of love. So compared to the earlier love mentioned, this is more of a godly spiritual love than just a friendship love. So we see that Jesus delays his trip by 2 whole days instead of getting up and going straight to Lazarus here. Many skeptics deem this as an unnatural and unlikely event and raises doubt regarding the historical value of this narrative. Others don't understand why Lazarus had to die, since Jesus could have easily raised him from his sickbed where he was 30 miles away. All of these doubts and objections, though, are invalid because they disregard the divine motives and they seek to substitute human motives in their place. Looking back at verse 4, we can conclude that Jesus was aware of God's will, and he acted in total and complete harmony with that. Lazarus being raised from the dead had to happen exactly as it did and at the exact time that it took place. Also, what prompts the doubters to believe that Lazarus was even still alive when the messenger got to Jesus? Lazarus, we find that Lazarus had been dead 4 days when they arrived. So he must have died fairly soon after the messenger's departure, seeing that it would have taken at least probably a day for the messenger to reach Jesus. It was part of the divine plan to raise Lazarus from the dead, and the delay of Jesus' arrival made it crystal clear to all that Lazarus was definitely dead when the miracle occurs. There's no question about that. Moving on to verse 7, says, "Then after this he said to the disciples, 'Let us go to Judea again.' The disciples said to him, 'Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and you're going there again?'" So Jesus decided after those 2 days of delaying his trip, he decides this to go to Judea again, to go see Lazarus. And he says here Judea, not Bethany, which I think is an interesting point. And it might seem kind of odd, but Judea was the province in which Jerusalem and Bethany were located. So it's more of an overarching idea and a location. And I think Jesus mentions here going back to Judea instead of just saying going to Bethany in order to show that he's not afraid of the persecution or the threats on his life that came from Judea, going back to a place that offered a stoning not too long earlier. To the disciples, they obviously feared for Jesus going back to Judea, but I would think they also probably feared for their own lives, since they were to travel with him. To them, the plan to go back would have seemed unwise and dangerous. And it really hadn't been long since they were there, and they barely avoided death the last time. They were afraid, but this is the only recorded effort that they made to dissuade Jesus. So we can see that they weren't cowards, and they stuck with Jesus even when things seemed dangerous. Verse 9, Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." Jesus here isn't saying there's only 12 hours in a day, but he instead is contrasting daytime from nighttime. During the day, we can see clearly where we're going. We don't stumble. But those who walk in the nighttime can't see the way clearly and have a much harder time reaching their destination. Now, of course, as he does throughout Scripture, Jesus here is speaking in a simile. The statement was made to show that there's a definite time for man in which to work that can neither be postponed nor changed. That's our life. The night comes by the divine will, and man can't avoid it or suspend it. Similarly, God has set a definite time for us to work, and the night, which is death, comes when we can no longer work. In John chapter 9, verse 4, Jesus said, "I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work." So the word day here designated time, but it means so much more with the context. It includes light and help, direction and blessing. Light is a synonym for truth. Darkness is a synonym for error and sin. These words from Jesus make it clear to the disciples that his course, which is to return to Judea, despite the anger and hatred, it was a decision in keeping with his mission. And as long as he walked in this light, his enemies' plans would be stomped out until his work is finished. These words were meant to explain to the disciples the reason for his action and to reassure them of the wisdom of that plan. Verse 11, "These things he said, and after that he said to them, 'Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up.' Then his disciples said, 'Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well.' However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought that he was speaking about taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus said to them plainly, 'Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him.' Then Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, 'Let us also go, that we may die with him.'" So Jesus made his intentions of what he was about to do crystal clear. Lazarus was dead, and Jesus was to wake him up, or rather, raise him from the dead. Of course, as we find many times throughout Scripture, the disciples didn't fully understand what Jesus meant by this statement, and they thought that Lazarus was better off sleeping. He would get better if he just rested from his sick state. So Jesus has to be more blunt with them, just simply telling them outright that Lazarus is dead. Verse 15 here is a really important statement and helps us further understand Jesus' reasoning in waiting the 2 days before going to see Lazarus. Up until this point, Jesus had performed many, many miracles of healing the sick, but not raising the dead. So the disciples were used to seeing such a miracle from him, and they just assumed that that's what was happening in this situation. But now they can truly see the situation and this coming miracle as significant as it was meant to be, because they are with Jesus the entire time that it happened. We know that the purpose of miracles was for strengthening of faith and helping witnesses believe in who Jesus was. Raising someone from the dead showed so much more divine power than just healing someone who's sick. After hearing about Lazarus being dead, there's no doubt that there was a gloom that just came over the disciples. And we can see very clearly how Thomas felt after hearing this news. At this point, all Thomas could dwell on was the determination of the Jews to destroy Jesus. And he was convinced that they would all die if they went back to Judea. But we also see that he wasn't a coward. Even believing that he was going to die, he would still go along and die with the Lord at the hands of their enemies. Now, in verse 16, it's a little confusing if you don't know the Hebrew term for Thomas and all that. But the word Thomas, it derives from Hebrew meaning the word twin, which is why it's mentioned there that he's called twin. Now, Thomas isn't mentioned super often in the New Testament, but it's clearly cast in the Scriptures that he's this very gloom, doom kind of guy, slow to believe, but yet having a deep, deep devotion to the Lord. And it seems likely here, knowing this Hebrew word, that likely Thomas had a twin, either a brother or a sister, we don't know. But as there's no mention otherwise of this in Scripture. Verse 17, so when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. So since we don't know exactly when Lazarus died in this period, or how long it took Jesus and his disciples to travel there, it's not super easy to have a definitive schedule of the events All we know with the timeline is that Jesus received word from the messenger, waited 2 days, and then Lazarus had been buried 4 days once Jesus had arrived. As was tradition, Lazarus would have been buried the same day that he died. And in keeping with the statutes which appears to have been characteristics for this family, he was buried in a private tomb. Only those who were quite well off were able to have tombs of their own, whether it was hewn into the rock or if it was a cave, which in this case is a cave that they just covered up with a stone. A private tomb was something that not everybody received. The bodies would then be taken to the tomb soon after the death, having been anointed with various spices and aromatic substances. In verse 19, when John mentions the Jews, he usually uses it in mention of those antagonistic to Jesus. And there's reason to assume that there's no reason to assume it's any different in this case. So these Jews came to offer condolences and to join in the mourning, which always comes with death. They exhibited friendship and kindness for the family because they were all of the Jewish race. But of course, their friendship didn't extend to Jesus and his disciples. The fact that the mourners there were numerous indicates the prominence of the family. Jewish tradition provided that there should be 7 days of public mourning and 30 days of private mourning for more prominent people. So this is a very extended and a big deal of an event. Verse 20, then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary was sitting in the house. So similar to what we find in Luke 10 with the account of Mary and Martha, their personalities kind of shine through here. Martha is the active, the busy one, the busybody, while Mary is the quiet, thoughtful, reflective one of the two. As soon as she hears of Jesus' coming, Martha drops everything she's doing to go and greet him. But we find that Mary was still in the house mourning her brother. Verse 21, now Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. So Martha's statement, even though it might seem like it at first, it holds no bitterness or resentment toward Jesus, only faith and love for him. There is, however, a feeling of regret and sadness that Jesus wasn't with them in Lazarus' final days, as well as the belief that if Jesus was there, he could have healed him. Martha's statement in verse 22 almost seems like she foresaw Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, but the following conversation I'm about to read, it shows otherwise. She simply believed that any statement Jesus made, God would grant it, but it doesn't seem here that she's considered what Jesus was actually about to do. Verse 23, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. So Jesus' response here is one of truth, but it's very unclear and indefinite, which is probably on purpose. Martha probably took it as Jesus consoling her in a time of mourning and nothing more. But we see Jesus continues on the conversation and leads her from sorrow into a robust and powerful faith. Martha needs to be shown there that there's another solution to the one that she brings up in verse 24. So verse 25, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. So Jesus obviously understood that Martha didn't fully comprehend what he was saying in verse 23. And so he sought to help her realize that he could and would raise Lazarus from the dead. He did this by first declaring that he is the resurrection and he is the life, meaning that the power of producing the resurrection and the life was in him. He was the origin, the design, and the power of both. In no way were they obtainable except by him. He then continues to explain how someone is to receive these things, which is by believing in him. He says, and though he may die, he shall live. The word die here indicated physical death. But we know that they shall spiritually live forever. And though they wouldn't be raised from physical death like Lazarus would, they would enjoy immortality in heaven, in the spiritual realm to come. James chapter 2, verse 26 says, for as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. So believing also requires obedience to his will in order to receive these promises. Belief is an important step, of course, but if we refuse to act on that faith, as it says in James, it's dead. We have nothing. Jesus then asks Martha if she understands what he's saying here, to which she responds by calling him the Son of God, confessing her belief in him. And the following phrase, who is to come into the world, shows that she now identified Jesus as the expected Messiah. Moving on to verse 28, says, And when she had said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary, her sister, saying, The teacher has come and is calling for you. As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, but was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, She is going to the tomb to weep there. So we find that Martha goes back to the house where Mary and the large crowd of mourners were, and she attempted to quietly draw Mary away, telling her that the teacher has come. But it seems like Mary didn't do the same thing Martha did, and Mary just got up and walked out, while Martha seems like she was more secretive, knowing that the mourners would probably follow if she tried to leave. I think Jesus was very purposeful in waiting at the same place he met Martha, not going to the house. As it was necessary to prepare Martha for a deeper understanding, Mary also needed that similar teaching. And this could be done much more effectively alone than it would be at the house where the mourners also were. Unfortunately, of course, we find that the mourners assumed she was going to mourn at the tomb, and so they went out and they followed her. So, of course, there's pros and there's cons to this happening with them following. Jesus' plan to talk to Mary alone to help her understand the way Martha did, it was now thwarted. Now he couldn't do that as easily because of this group that followed her. But in the same vein, now there was a much larger crowd. And they would all be present to witness this miracle that was about to take place, and all be witnesses of it. 32, Then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. 35, Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, See how he loved him? And some of them said, Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? So similarly to Martha's response to seeing Jesus, Mary mourns to Jesus that he could have saved Lazarus if only he had arrived sooner. But Mary doesn't continue with the hope that Martha had in her statement. I think the similarity between these sister statements to Jesus shows that it must have been something that they talked about. It would have been an exchange following Lazarus' death before Jesus arrived, as they were talking as sisters. We see here that Mary and the Jews with her were weeping. The translated word here, which is klio, denotes the idea of crying audibly, sobbing, maybe even wailing in tears. Mary wept bitterly, and her sorrow ran over the entire group that wept with her. And then in verse 35, we read that Jesus also wept, but the translated word here for that wept is different than Mary's. This word is dakruo, which means that to shed tears instead of wailing. I see this more as a quiet sobbing, seeing the grief that's come over Mary and feeling sympathy and understanding for the grieving sister. So we do see that Jesus also wept and felt that, but in a different way than Mary and the group might have been doing it. When Jesus was groaned in the spirit, as it says, the translated word here conveys the nature of anger. Most likely, Jesus was angry with death itself, which brought such sorrow to him as well as to the sisters whom he loved. Now, there's no shame or sin in tears. Jesus was not ashamed of his humanity, and he wasn't afraid to show it. He identified with others in their sorrow, and he deeply loved people. He suffered all the innocent infirmities of our nature, and he showed how to handle grief in kindness, generosity, love, and dignity. Now, some of the Jews here, they saw Jesus' grief and his sorrow, but others didn't seem to care, as they only seized that occasion to disparage Jesus by audibly wondering why he didn't exercise his powers that he was alleged to have performed in the case of healing the blind man and just have raised Lazarus from being sick. Once again, we see here that no one even suspects the thought that Jesus could raise Lazarus from the dead. Verse 38, then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he's been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? So the people here seem to express genuine words of sorrow that even Jesus, to them, he couldn't do anything for Lazarus. They thought he just maybe wanted to see Lazarus. Everyone thought it was super strange, of course, to take away this stone. They didn't fully grasp what was about to happen. Of course, this is equivalent to us seeing someone digging up a grave. It's odd to even consider that as a thought. But Jesus had a plan. He had a purpose for what he was doing. People may have thought that Jesus was so taken with grief that he simply wanted to look at his friend. So everyone knows Lazarus is dead because his body, we see, starts to decompose. And there's a foul stench that fills the entire space. And this is where we learn that Lazarus has been dead 4 days. So there's no doubt in anyone's mind that Lazarus is dead. They said, the text says, if you would believe, you would see the glory of God. Jesus says that to them. Now, he didn't need Martha or Mary's faith to perform this miracle. He's capable of doing anything. But if they wouldn't believe, they would never see the glory of God, as he says, meaning that they would miss being with God in the glory of the fulfillment of his plan. Of course, they could see the result and be happy that someone has been risen, but they wouldn't be a part of God's great plan and purpose, knowing what was actually happening. The taking away the stone was a sure and a wonderful step of faith. Mary and Martha were compelled to act on their faith, and they did so by obeying the command that they were given. We see that Jesus gives Martha a promise, draws attention to himself, calls upon her to confess her faith, and then calls for her to act on that faith in Jesus. And we can see the same pattern in what we're called to do every single day. Verse 41, then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me, but because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you have sent me. These simple words of thanksgiving is all that was needed for this miracle. No fancy incantations, no wrestling in prayer, no drama, no dramatic act was needed. Jesus simply called Lazarus out of the tomb. The way that Jesus performs his miracles is so beautiful. And if Jesus is our example and our role model, I think we have a lot to learn just by observing how he conducts himself and the words that he speaks when performing miracles and helping other people. It's never for himself. It's never for a superficial show. He always gives God the glory in what he's doing every single time. Verse 43, now when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, loose him and let him go. So we see Jesus cries out with a loud voice of authority. It partly suggests that he wanted the crowd to hear so they could know that this was the power of God. And all that was needed was for him to speak. That's all that he needed to do, was tell Lazarus to come forth. So we see Lazarus, he arose, bound, still in his grave clothes. Now there's much speculation on how exactly he moved. Some older writers believe that he might have glided in midair, while others simply suppose that he was able to shuffle to the door, or maybe his feet might have been a little bit unbound. We don't really know. But we do know that he had help because Jesus commanded that he be loosened and let go. Here we find that Jesus didn't miraculously remove the grave clothes from Lazarus, but instead he asked the attendants to do so. He wanted them to work together to help free this man from his bonds. And I think that's an interesting and beautiful illustration that we can all glean from, to helping each other. Verse 45, then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." So those who were sorrowful had come together to be with the grieving sisters, and they didn't expect that their reason for sorrow would be so quickly taken away. This was undoubtedly a miraculous and an impressive work of God. And for many, it actually validated and solidified their faith, as we see in verse 45. They were able to put their trust in who Jesus said he was by seeing what he did on this occasion. And as we've discussed in previous lessons, Jesus' prophecies and foretelling came to pass here. The words and miracles of Jesus, they divide man between believers and non-believers. Someone recognize his power and greatness, even acknowledge it, but still work against him, even with that knowledge. They responded to him in some of the cruelest conduct recorded in human history, even after knowing who he was. Verse 47, they said, "For this man works many signs." So these religious leaders, they privately admitted to each other that Jesus performed the works that authenticated his claims as Messiah. They knew who he was. Looking back at John 10:25, Jesus said, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me." So we can clearly see that Christ's works, they truly did bear a witness of him. And the Jews also saw this in these works. So first they opposed Jesus because they weren't convinced he was the Messiah. Now they recognize his authenticity, but respond by denying him, afraid of his influence over the people and afraid of losing their power and their influence over those people. The religious leaders, they knew the logical response to the works of Jesus was to believe and to follow. And they knew that there was no stopping the people from believing. They literally said, if we let him alone like this, everyone will believe him. They knew. His glory is evident, and there's no hiding it. However, even the Pharisees didn't leave him alone and did everything in their power to stop him. Christianity grew more because of his death. And it's because they didn't leave Christ alone that we believe and we worship and we have what we need. In their efforts to squash the good news of his works and stop his influence, the Christian faith grew ever stronger, and it holds strong even today. They also said the Romans will come and take away our place and nation. There's something to be said about these religious leaders thinking of the temple as their place, as if it belonged to them. We might even say that people in the church today might do the same, becoming possessive of traditions and customs, forgetting that the church belongs to Jesus. So the rejection of Jesus divided this nation, and it saw political ruin. Their refusal to accept Jesus as Lord played a part in their own demise, as we find out later. Verse 49, and one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish." Now this he did not say on his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So Caiaphas, we see that he thought logically and politically, but not morally here. It was certainly not moral to reject the Savior and put an innocent man to death. To Caiaphas, it was simply a matter of expediency, requiring no consideration of justice or what was really right. It was better for one man to die than for a nation to perish, as he says. But here we also see that Caiaphas gave sort of an unconscious and involuntary prophecy. John was careful to give the proper credit here. He's urging them to put Jesus to death. The way that he words this information, however, is an unconscious prophecy. It's prophetic. John explains that the unconscious prophecy of Caiaphas was greater than he could have ever imagined. Now, of course, it doesn't click to Caiaphas of what he's actually saying in that moment. The death of Jesus would also unite the people that he came to save. It's important to note in verse 49, something that might be confusing, that Caiaphas, it says, being high priest that year. That doesn't just mean that he was high priest that year. It just means that he was high priest during the time of this event. He had multiple years that he was high priest, but just a little note to not be confused in that statement. Verse 53, then from that day on they plotted to put him to death. Therefore Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there into the country near the wilderness to a city called Ephraim, and there remained with his disciples. And the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went from the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. Then they sought Jesus and spoke amongst themselves as they stood in the temple. What do you think, that he will not come to the feast? Now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a command that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it, that they might seize him. So at first, lesser religious officials wanted Jesus dead. But at this point, those with real political power wanted to murder him. Despite all that he had done for the people and for the power that he had displayed to them, they continued to deny him and began their plot to end his life. Verse 54 says, therefore Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews. Now Jesus didn't do this out of fear or retaliation against them. But we know that his hour had not yet come. And even in these last final hours, he still had work to do, like praying for his disciples. So we find that the Passover was near, and this gives us a little bit more of a timeline, as this Passover was the event at which time Jesus would be betrayed, arrested, condemned, and crucified. Verse 56, they say that he will not come to the feast. They think that he's just not going to come to the feast because he's scared. This wording indicates that they expected the answer to be no. They thought he would not come to the feast. They might have considered it unlikely that Jesus would make an appearance and risk his captivity. Now, it's interesting to note that most of these chief priests were Sadducees, and it was common for Sadducees and Pharisees to be uncooperative with each other. They didn't like each other. But here we find that they actually have a common goal and interest in their rejection, their hatred of Jesus. As we're wrapping up, we'll go to chapter 12. Verse 1, chapter 12 says, then 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. Verse 7, but Jesus said, let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always. So Jesus here gives us another time marker. This was the last week before the death and the burial of Jesus. Almost half of John's gospel is given to this final week. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. So Jesus attended a dinner in Bethany less than a week before his death. Now, I'm sure Jesus probably had a lot on his mind, knowing what was about to come to pass. He may not have felt like socializing. He may not have wanted to be with others, might have just wanted to be alone with the Father and with his close friends. We don't know what he was feeling at the moment, but he went to this dinner continuing to act selflessly. The purpose of this dinner is likely to have celebrated the raising of Lazarus, as Lazarus is mentioned twice in verses 1 and 2. And it seems that this dinner, we actually can find in Matthew 26, that this dinner took place in the home of Simon the leper. So we have Martha, Lazarus, and Mary attending, and Martha seems to be the hostess here. Now in the midst of this supper, Mary gave a special gift to Jesus. It was common in this time to wash the feet of a guest, but what made this more unusual is that she did it during the meal and used very costly oil to do it. And if that wasn't enough, instead of using a towel or a cloth or anything else, she used her own hair to clean off that oil. So sometimes it may be hard to understand what's taking place at this moment, but I think we can all agree that this is an act of pure humility. This specific task was one that typically a slave would attend to, of washing the feet of visitors. It was a very lowly act, but Mary had no hesitations in lowering herself to that point for Jesus. Her actions show humility and devotion to Jesus in this moment. An important thing to note is that Matthew and Mark, in their account, they mention the ointment was poured on the head of Jesus, but not on the feet. John tells us that it was poured on the feet, but not on the head. And now these don't contradict, as some might think. But instead, they give us the entire story. Just as every time something like this happens, we have to go from every point of view, as they all have different points of view. So we have the full thing here. So she did both. So not only was this act humble, but it also cost her. Using an entire pound of oil, a very costly oil of spikenard, she spent a large investment on Jesus, and she did it very gratefully. Now we see that Judas responded, and he believed that this oil was worth around 300 denarii, which is about a whole year's wages for a typical working man at that time. Of course, not everyone saw Mary's gift as honorable. Judas, who would soon betray Jesus, became angry and didn't see the worth and the meaning in what she had done here. He may have felt shame by her simple and powerful display of love, and he knew that what would soon take place. We didn't know exactly what his internal feelings were at this moment, but we can clearly see a loud outburst of emotions. And interestingly, this is the only place we find in the New Testament that Judas is mentioned as doing something evil other than his betrayal of Jesus. He successfully hid the darkness in his heart from everyone except Jesus. We have to remember that Jesus knows us intimately, and he sees the deepest and darkest corners of our inner being. You can hide from your parents, your friends, your siblings, your work friends, people you go to school with, but Jesus is always there, and he knows you. Now we can imagine that this would be a very awkward scene. Mary selflessly acts out of love and devotion, and Judas ridicules her in front of everyone. Judas shows his true interest and values, which here is financial gain. He doesn't hold God's values close to his heart, and he's blinded by his own self-lusts. In Matthew 26, we actually see that some might have agreed with Judas. What they had all just witnessed was probably a bit of a culture shock and may have caused some embarrassing silence for a moment, broken by one voice giving expressions to the sentiment of many. Now we know that we can never deserve Jesus, and there's nothing we could ever say or do that will earn our salvation. But the lesson here is that we still have a duty to work and to try and to grow and persevere. We won't ever be perfect, of course, but that doesn't mean God gives us the green light to be terrible human beings or to give anything less than our best. God wants fighters, and he wants those who care, who have full faith in him, and who want that better and brighter future. We read that Jesus immediately defends Mary after she's ridiculed. If we're extreme in our love for Jesus, he's not going to send us away. He'll not criticize as Judas did. It's far better to be like Mary than to be like Judas. He also responds and says, "She has done this for the day of my burial." Imagine you're at a funeral, maybe even an expensive funeral, with ornate decorations and a costly casket. Wouldn't it be extremely rude to go to the family and criticize and judge them for how much they spent on this funeral? In a similar way, it was inappropriate for Judas or anyone else to judge or put a price on Mary's gift. She's probably very emotional at this moment and wants to simply show her love and her devotion to Jesus. And Judas couldn't see how beautiful of a thing that was. Let's move on to verse 9 as we wrap up. It says, "Now a great many of the Jews knew that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests plotted to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him many of the Jews went away and believed in Jesus." The chief priests were mostly made up of Sadducees who didn't believe in the resurrection. So Lazarus, a living example of life after death, of resurrection, was an embarrassment to them and their entire theological system. There was only one solution for them, of course, now let's put Lazarus to death. It says, on account of him, many of the Jews believed in Jesus. So not only did Lazarus raise from the dead, but Jews were believing in the message because of this miracle. And as a result, the religious leaders sought all the more to put an end to it. Lastly, the phrase "went away and believed" here suggests that people were increasingly believing in Jesus. Of course, word travels very quickly, especially when a miracle has just been performed. And when people searched and find nothing but facts, those who desire no personal gain will use logic to see the truth, to find it and see it and apply it. Those who desire salvation will see the truth, and those who are truly faithful will walk in that truth.